The old farmhouse stood at the end of a winding gravel road, surrounded by fields that stretched toward the horizon like a patchwork quilt of green and gold. Sarah had forgotten how quiet it could be out here, away from the city's constant hum. As she turned off the engine of her car, the silence settled around her like a soft blanket, broken only by the distant call of a meadowlark and the gentle rustling of cottonwood leaves in the afternoon breeze. She stepped out onto the gravel, feeling the small stones shift beneath her feet, and took a deep breath. The air smelled different here, sweet with growing things, warm earth, and the faint perfume of wild clover. It was late spring, and the farm was waking up in all the ways she remembered from childhood. The lilac bushes her grandmother had planted decades ago drooped heavy with purple blooms beside the porch steps, and she could see where someone had recently mowed the lawn, leaving neat rows of darker and lighter green stripes across the yard. The farmhouse itself looked smaller than she remembered, the way childhood places often do when you return to them as an adult. White clapboard siding, a wide front porch with a swing that moved slightly in the breeze, windows with green shutters that had faded to a softer sage over the years. The screen door still had that little squeak she noticed as she pulled it open, the same sound that had announced every coming and going throughout her summers here as a child. Inside, the house was cool and dim and smelled of old wood and lavender sachets. Dust motes drifted through the slanting afternoon light that fell through the kitchen window. She set her bags down and walked slowly through the rooms, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Everything was exactly as she remembered, and yet somehow different, smaller, quieter, more still. The kitchen table, worn smooth by decades of meals and conversations, sat beneath the window that looked out over the back garden. She could see the vegetable patch already planted for the season, with neat rows of young tomato plants and bean poles waiting for their climbers. Someone had been taking care of things. Her aunt, probably, who lived in the next town over and had kept an eye on the place since her grandmother passed. Sarah moved to the back door and stepped out onto the wooden porch that ran the length of the house. The afternoon was growing long now, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the western fields. The light had that particular golden quality that comes in late spring, soft and warm, making everything it touched look like it had been painted with honey. From here, she could see the old barn, its red paint weathered to a rusty burgundy, and beyond it, the orchard where apple trees stood in patient rows. She could hear chickens clucking somewhere nearby, and realized her aunt must have started keeping them again. The sound was comforting, domestic, a gentle reminder that life continued in its rhythms here, regardless of who came or went. She sat down on the porch steps, feeling the wood warm beneath her, and simply looked out at the land. The fields beyond the house were being worked by a neighbor she could see, the young corn already pushing up in even lines. The sight of it made something in her chest loosen, a tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. She had come here to rest, to recover from the exhaustion that had been building for months in the city. The doctor had called it burnout, that modern affliction of doing too much for too long with too little sleep. "You need to slow down," he'd said, and had suggested she find somewhere quiet somewhere far from deadlines and obligations and the constant ping of notifications. And so she had thought of this place, her grandmother's farm, sitting empty except for her aunt's occasional visits. She had called and asked if she might stay for the summer, and her aunt had been delighted. "Oh, honey," she'd said, "that place needs someone in it. And I think maybe you need it too." Sitting here now, watching the light change as the sun moved lower, Sarah thought her aunt might be right. There was something healing in the quietness, in the way time seemed to move differently here. Not slowly, exactly, but more gently, like a river that knew its path and took its time getting there. A cat appeared from beneath the porch, a large orange tabby who regarded her with calm green eyes before settling into a patch of sunlight at the bottom of the steps. She hadn't known there was a cat, but she wasn't surprised. There had always been barn cats here, and this one looked well-fed and content, clearly used to the place. "Hello," she said softly, and the cat's ears swiveled toward her, acknowledging the greeting without feeling the need to respond. After a moment, it began to wash its face with one paw, the picture of unhurried contentment. Sarah smiled and leaned back against the porch post, feeling her shoulders drop away from her ears, feeling her breathing slow to match the peaceful rhythm of the afternoon. She would unpack later. For now, she wanted to simply sit and let the quietness soak into her bones. The meadowlark called again, its song rising and falling in the warm air. In the orchard, she could see apple blossoms still clinging to some of the branches, white and pink against the darkening green of the leaves. The breeze shifted, bringing with it the scent of fresh-cut hay from a distant field and the sweet green smell of growing things. This was what she had needed, she realized. Not just rest, but this particular kind of peace. The peace that comes from being in a place where things grow at their own pace, where the day's urgency is measured in the movement of the sun rather than the ticking of a clock, where the most important sounds are birdsong and wind and the contented murmuring of chickens settling down for the evening. She sat there as the light continued to soften and the shadows grew longer, feeling something inside her begin to unwind, like a spring that had been wound too tight for too long. She didn't need to do anything, didn't need to be anywhere, didn't need to accomplish or achieve or produce. She could simply be here in this moment, on this porch, watching the day turn gently toward evening. The orange cat finished its ablutions and tucked its paws beneath its chest, eyes half closing in satisfaction. Sarah watched it for a while, then let her own eyes drift shut, feeling the warmth of the late afternoon sun on her face, listening to the small sounds of the farm settling into evening, the chickens' soft clucking, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of leaves in the cottonwoods. She would start tomorrow, she thought drowsily. Tomorrow she would explore the house properly, would walk the property, would begin to establish the gentle rhythms of her days here. But for now, this moment of arrival, of homecoming, was enough. More than enough. Sarah woke to a sound she hadn't heard in years, a rooster crowing in the pearl-gray light of dawn. For a moment, she lay still in her grandmother's old bed, disoriented, before memory returned and she smiled. The room around her was dim, but she could see the familiar shapes of the dresser with its oval mirror, the rocking chair by the window, the wedding ring quilt folded at the foot of the bed. She had slept deeply, dreamlessly, in a way she hadn't managed in months. The bed was soft but firm, the sheets smelled of lavender and line-dried cotton, and the house had been so quiet through the night that there had been nothing to disturb her rest. Even now, in the early morning, the silence was remarkable. No traffic sounds, no sirens, no neighbors' televisions through thin walls. Just the rooster's occasional declaration and the first tentative songs of birds greeting the day. She rose slowly, stretching, and padded to the window. The sun wasn't up yet, but the sky was lightening in the east, turning from deep blue to violet to that particular shade of pink that only happens at dawn. The fields were still dark, but she could make out their shapes, and beyond them, a low mist hung over what she remembered was a creek running through the property. The floorboards were cool beneath her feet as she made her way down the narrow stairs, one hand trailing along the smooth wooden banister. In the kitchen, she found coffee in the cupboard. Her aunt must have stocked the basics and set about making a pot. The old percolator took its time, bubbling and muttering to itself on the stove, filling the kitchen with that rich, roasted smell that seems especially good in the early morning. While she waited, she explored the cupboards, finding dishes she remembered. The blue willowware plates her grandmother had collected, heavy ceramic mugs, jars of preserves with handwritten labels dating from last summer. There was bread in the bread box, still fresh, and butter in the old refrigerator that hummed contentedly in the corner. She poured herself coffee and took it out to the front porch, wrapping her grandmother's cardigan, found hanging on a hook by the door, around her shoulders against the morning chill. The rooster crowed again, and she could hear the hens beginning to stir in their coop, making soft, conversational noises as they woke. The world was emerging from darkness now, the sky growing lighter by the minute, colors returning to things that had been only shapes and shadows. She could see the garden more clearly now, could make out the careful rows, the bean poles, the tomato cages already in place for when the plants would need them. Someone, her aunt, had clearly been tending it carefully, and Sarah felt a wave of gratitude for this quiet caretaking. The orange cat appeared, materializing out of the gray light the way cats do, and wound around her ankles before sitting down to regard the sunrise with her. Together, they watched as the sun crept up over the eastern fields, turning the sky first pink, then gold, then the pale blue of morning. It happened slowly enough that you could see it happening, which was somehow different from the city, where sunrise always seemed to occur while you were looking elsewhere. As the light grew stronger, Sarah could see the farm coming alive. A few cows in a distant pasture moved toward their water trough. Birds were singing in earnest now, robins, wrens, and that meadowlark again with its liquid, falling song. The mist over the creek was beginning to lift, revealing the line of willows that marked the water's path. She finished her coffee slowly, in no hurry to do anything, and found herself naturally falling into awareness of all the small details around her. The way the dew made spider webs visible in the grass, each one a perfect geometric miracle. The exact shade of green the leaves became when the sun first touched them. The pattern of bird song, how one bird would call and another would answer from a different part of the yard, carrying on their morning conversations. When she finally went back inside, the day had fully begun. The kitchen was warm now with sunlight streaming through the windows, and Sarah made herself breakfast. Toast and jam, eggs from what she assumed were the hens she could hear, and ate at the kitchen table, looking out at the garden. The food tasted better than she remembered food tasting, but she suspected that had more to do with her state of mind than any particular quality of the ingredients. When you're not rushing, not eating while doing 3 other things, food becomes something to pay attention to again. After breakfast, she washed her dishes by hand in the deep farmhouse sink, taking her time with it, finding something meditative in the warm water and the simple task. Then she dressed and went outside to explore. The morning air was warming quickly, but still held a freshness that would burn off by afternoon. She walked first to the chicken coop, where a dozen hens scratched and pecked in their enclosed run. They looked up at her approach, curious but not alarmed, and she saw the water font needed filling. She found a hose and attended to it, then scattered some feed from a bin in the small shed attached to the coop. The hens hurried over, murmuring their appreciation, and she found herself smiling at their earnest industry. From there, she wandered through the garden, seeing what had been planted and what was already beginning to grow. Lettuce, still small, but identifiable. Peas on their trellis. Tomato plants that would need careful tending through the summer. Herbs in a separate bed. Basil, oregano, thyme, sage, all sending up their aromatic new growth. She made a mental note to tend this garden, to make it her project for the summer. Beyond the garden was the barn, its doors standing open to the morning air. She stepped inside, into the cool dimness, and breathed in the smell of hay and old wood and dust dancing in the shafts of light that fell through the gaps in the boards. There wasn't much here anymore. Some tools hanging neatly on the walls, a few hay bales in one corner, an old tractor that looked like it hadn't run in years. But the space felt peaceful, almost sacred in its quietness. She climbed the ladder to the hayloft and found it mostly empty, just a scattering of old hay and some swallows' nests tucked up in the rafters. The big loft door stood open, framing a view of the fields beyond, and she sat in the doorway for a while, legs dangling, looking out at the land that stretched away in all directions. From here, she could see the full extent of the property, the house and its outbuildings, the garden and orchard, the fields beyond that rolled gently toward the horizon. It wasn't a large farm by commercial standards, but it was substantial enough, a self-contained world. She could understand why her grandmother had loved it, had chosen to stay here through all the years, even after her grandfather died, even when her children had urged her to move to something smaller, easier. There was something complete about a place like this, Sarah thought. Something whole. It provided what you needed: shelter, food, purpose, peace. The rhythms were ancient and dependable. Seeds became plants, became food, became seeds again. The seasons turned. The sun rose and set. The work was never finished, but it was never pointless either. Everything connected to everything else in ways that made sense. She sat there for a long time, thinking about nothing in particular, just watching the way the light moved across the fields, the way the wind made patterns in the young corn, the way the clouds sailed by overhead like slow ships on a blue sea. Her mind, usually so busy with plans and worries and endless mental checklists, felt quieter here. The space around her seemed to create space within her, room for thoughts to spread out and breathe. Eventually she climbed back down and continued her exploration, walking through the orchard where the apple trees stood in their rows, most of the blossoms fallen now, tiny green apples beginning to form. There were peach trees too, she discovered, and a few pear trees. In late summer and fall, this would be a place of abundance. But for now, it was simply green and growing, the trees doing their patient work of turning sunlight and water into fruit. At the far edge of the orchard, she found a bench, weathered and worn, positioned to look out over the fields. She sat down, wondering how many times her grandmother had sat in this exact spot, and found that it felt like visiting an old friend. The bench knew the weight of contemplation, the value of simply sitting and looking. The morning was passing now, the sun climbing higher, the day growing warmer. Sarah felt no urgency to do anything in particular. She would need to go into town eventually, to introduce herself to the neighbors, to understand the systems and rhythms of the place. But not today. Today was for settling, for allowing her body and mind to adjust to this new, slower pace. She walked back to the house, taking a different route, following the fence line, discovering an old grape arbor half hidden by undergrowth, and a patch of wild strawberries beginning to bloom. Everything she saw felt like a small gift, a discovery, even though she had been here countless times as a child. Back at the house, she found the orange cat sleeping on the porch in a patch of sun, and she stepped carefully over it to go inside. The house was warm now with midday sun, and she opened windows to let in the breeze. Then, feeling suddenly tired in a good way, she lay down on the couch in the living room, intending to rest for just a moment. She woke 2 hours later to find the afternoon well advanced and the cat sitting on the back of the couch, watching her with knowing green eyes. She smiled, stretched, and rose without any feeling of guilt about the nap. This was exactly what she had come here to do, to rest, to let her body remember what it felt like to be truly at ease. The days began to form a pattern, gentle and unforced. Sarah would wake with the rooster, sometimes even before, coming to consciousness naturally as the sky lightened rather than being jerked from sleep by an alarm. She would lie in bed for a few minutes, listening to the morning sounds, birds, the stirring of chickens, sometimes the distant lowing of cattle, before rising and making her way downstairs. Coffee on the front porch became her morning ritual, a time to watch the day begin and to let her mind settle into wakefulness gradually. The cat, whom she had started calling Marmalade, would join her, the two of them companionable in their silence as the sun rose and the farm came alive around them. After breakfast, she was eating better here, she noticed, taking time to cook eggs properly, to make oatmeal with fruit from the preserves, to sit and actually taste her food. She would tend to the chickens. She had learned their rhythms quickly, when they needed water and feed, when to collect eggs. The hens had accepted her presence, and she found something deeply satisfying about this simple caretaking, this daily exchange of attention for eggs. Then came the garden work. This was where she spent most of her mornings, and she was surprised by how much she enjoyed it. Her hands learned again the feel of soil, the way to pull weeds without disturbing the plants you wanted to keep. How much water was too much or too little. The garden responded to her care, the plants visibly growing each day. And there was something miraculous about that, about putting a tiny seed in the ground and watching it become food. She worked slowly, without rushing, often stopping to rest and look around, to appreciate the moment. This was so different from her city life, where everything had been urgent, where every minute had to be productive, where there was never enough time. Here, time felt abundant. The work would be there tomorrow. The garden didn't care if she took a break to watch a butterfly or to follow Marmalade on an exploratory walk through the orchard. Afternoons were hot, and she learned to rest during the peak heat, retreating to the coolness of the house to read or nap or simply sit in the living room and look out the windows. She had brought books with her, novels she'd been meaning to read for years. And now she had the time to sink into them properly, to read slowly and savor the language instead of racing through pages on her commute. Sometimes she would bake in the afternoons, using her grandmother's old recipes that she found in a wooden box in the kitchen. Bread, biscuits, a cobbler made with berries from the hedgerow at the edge of the property. The act of baking was meditative, all that mixing and kneading, and the house would fill with smells that made her think of childhood summers, of her grandmother moving around this same kitchen, humming to herself as she worked. Evenings were for walking. As the day cooled, she would set out to explore different parts of the property or the surrounding area. She found paths through the fields, discovered where the creek ran widest and shallowest, perfect for wading. She walked the country roads, where cars passed so infrequently that their appearance was an event, and neighbors would wave from their porches or stop to talk if she passed their houses. She met the neighbors this way, gradually. The Andersons, who farmed the land to the north, and whose son managed the planting of her own fields. The elderly Mrs. Chen, who lived alone in a small house down the road and kept an immaculate flower garden. The Morrison family, with their 3 young children, who sometimes rode their bikes up and down the road, their laughter carrying on the evening air. Everyone knew who she was, of course. News traveled in the country, and they were universally kind, welcoming her without overwhelming her, understanding without being told that she needed space and quiet. "Your grandmother was a good woman," Mrs. Chen told her one evening, and the simple statement, delivered with such sincerity, made Sarah's eyes sting with unexpected tears. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed this, she thought, as she walked back to the farmhouse that evening, the sky turning pink and orange above her. This sense of community, of belonging to a place, and having that place know you. In the city, she had lived in her apartment building for 3 years and could not name a single neighbor. Here, after just a couple of weeks, she knew everyone within a mile, and they knew her. The evenings were her favorite time. After her walk, she would sit on the back porch and watch the sun set over the fields, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and purple. Marmalade would settle beside her, and the chickens would make their way to their coop, murmuring sleepily as they jostled for their preferred roosting spots. As the light faded, the night sounds would begin. Crickets and tree frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl, the mysterious rustlings of small creatures going about their nocturnal business. The stars would emerge, more of them than she ever saw in the city, until the sky was dense with light, the Milky Way a clouded path across the darkness. She would stay out until full dark sometimes, just watching the stars, wrapped in her grandmother's cardigan against the cooling air, feeling small in the best way, part of something vast and ancient and ongoing. The universe turning overhead, the earth turning below, the garden growing in the dark, the chickens sleeping, the cat purring beside her, everything in its place, everything connected. Then she would go inside, make herself a cup of tea, and read until she felt sleep approaching. The house would be quiet around her, the only sounds the ticking of the old clock in the hallway and the settling noises of an old house at rest. She would climb the stairs slowly, get ready for bed without hurry, and slip between the lavender-scented sheets with a feeling of deep contentment. Sleep came easily now, without the tossing and turning that had plagued her in the city. Her body was tired in a good way, physically tired from the day's work, rather than that jittery mental exhaustion that comes from too much stress and screen time. Her mind was quiet, not racing with worries and plans, just peacefully ready for rest. And so the days passed, one rolling gently into the next, each one similar, but never quite the same. The garden grew, the vegetables began to ripen, first the lettuce and radishes, then peas and green beans. She learned to harvest them at the right moment, learned which ones were best eaten immediately and which ones could wait. She learned the rhythms of the weather, how to read the sky for coming rain, when the heat would break into afternoon storms that rolled across the plains with impressive displays of lightning and thunder. She learned to open all the windows when a storm was coming, to let the house breathe in that electric pre-storm air, and then to close them again when the rain began, sitting in the living room and watching the water pour down, feeling grateful for the roof over her head and the drumming sound of rain on the porch. She learned the sounds of the farm, which creaks and groans were normal, which bird songs meant what time of day, how the wind sounded different when it came from the north versus the south. She learned which hens were friendly and which preferred to keep their distance, learned Marmalade's preferred sleeping spots and favorite times for affection. Her body began to change in small ways. Her hands developed calluses from garden work. Her skin tanned despite her sun hat. Her muscles grew stronger from all the walking and lifting and bending. She felt more solid somehow, more present in her physical self. The tension she'd carried in her shoulders for years gradually released. The headaches that had been her constant companion in the city became rare, then disappeared entirely. Her mind changed too. The constant mental chatter, the endless loop of worries and should-dos and what-ifs grew quieter. She found she could sit and think about nothing in particular, or focus completely on one simple task without her attention fragmenting into a dozen directions. She began to notice things, the exact color of a tomato ripening, the particular way the light fell through the apple trees, the small variations in birdsong from morning to evening. Time itself felt different, more elastic. Days that seemed to pass slowly were somehow also weeks, then a month, then longer. She wasn't bored. There was always something to do, something to tend, something to notice. But neither was she busy in the way she'd been before. She was simply occupied, engaged with the present moment and whatever it held. She started keeping a journal, writing in it each evening before bed, recording the small events of the day, what she'd planted or harvested what she'd seen on her walk, conversations with neighbors, observations about the weather or the animals or the changing season. Reading back over entries from weeks before, she was surprised by how much had happened, how much had changed, even in the apparent sameness of the days. She realized she was healing, not just resting, but actually healing from whatever had broken in her during those years of too much work, too much stress, too much pressure to be constantly productive and available and on. The cracks were filling in, the worn-down parts rebuilding. She felt herself becoming whole again, or perhaps becoming whole in a way she'd never quite been before. By the time July arrived, Sarah felt as if she had always lived here, as if her city life had been a dream from which she had woken. The garden was in full production now, and she spent her mornings harvesting vegetables, often more than she could use. She learned to preserve what she couldn't eat fresh, making pickles, canning tomatoes, blanching and freezing beans. Her grandmother's canning equipment, found in the basement, came back into service, and the pantry shelves began to fill with jars of jewel-toned vegetables. She shared the bounty with her neighbors, and they returned the favor with their own surplus. Mrs. Chen brought her cucumbers and Asian greens from her garden. The Andersons sent over sweet corn, so fresh that the kernels burst with milky sweetness when you bit into them. The Morrisons contributed zucchini bread and fresh eggs from their chickens, apologizing for the zucchini, as everyone always does when zucchini season hits. These exchanges felt different from anything Sarah had experienced in the city. There was no accounting, no keeping track of who owed whom what. It was simply sharing, the way communities had operated for thousands of years before money complicated everything. You gave what you had surplus of, you received what others had abundance of, and everyone benefited. The heat of summer settled over the farm like a warm blanket. The days were long and languid, the sun intense by midday, the afternoons thick and drowsy. Sarah adapted her schedule, rising even earlier to work in the relative cool of morning, resting through the hottest hours, emerging again in the evening when the world became bearable once more. She discovered the creek was perfect for cooling off on hot afternoons. There was a spot where the water ran over smooth stones into a pool deep enough to lie down in, and she would walk down there with a book and spend an hour in the shade of the willows, reading and occasionally slipping into the water to cool down. Marmalade sometimes followed her, watching skeptically from the bank, never quite understanding why anyone would voluntarily get wet. The orchard was heavy with growing fruit now, apples swelling day by day, peaches beginning to show their blush of pink and orange. She walked through it every evening, checking on progress, planning for the harvest to come. There would be so much fruit, more than she could possibly use. But the neighbors had already mentioned they'd help with picking and would be happy to take some in exchange. She had stopped thinking about returning to the city. At first, she had told herself this was just for the summer, just until she felt better, just until she figured out what to do next. But as the weeks passed, that narrative had quietly dissolved. She didn't want to figure out what to do next. She wanted to stay here, to tend this garden, to watch the seasons turn, to be part of this small community. The realization came to her one evening as she sat on the back porch, shelling peas into a bowl. Her hands moved automatically. Her mind was quiet, The evening was soft around her, and she suddenly understood with perfect clarity that she was home. Not visiting, not recovering, not hiding. Home. It should have been a frightening thought. What about her career, her apartment, her life in the city? But it wasn't. Those things felt distant and unimportant, like clothes that no longer fit. She didn't want them back. She wanted this, the simple work, the quiet days, the deep satisfaction of growing food and tending animals and being part of a place. She called her aunt that evening, and when she mentioned the possibility of staying, her aunt laughed with delight. "Oh, honey, I was hoping you'd say that. The place is yours if you want it. Your grandmother left it to all of us, but none of us are using it, and it needs someone who'll love it the way she did." They talked for a long time, working out the practicalities. Sarah would need to officially take over the property, would need to understand the finances and the arrangements with the Andersons for farming the fields. But these were solvable problems, her aunt assured her. The important thing was that the farm would continue, that it would be a home again. After the call, Sarah sat for a long time in the darkening kitchen, letting the decision settle into her bones. She had quit her job. That call had been harder, but necessary, had given notice on her apartment, had begun the process of relocating her life from the city to this small room. And it all felt right, like puzzle pieces clicking into place. The next morning, she woke with a sense of purpose that was different from the drivenness that had characterized her city life. This wasn't about achievement or success or proving anything. It was about stewardship, about caring for this place and letting it care for her in return, about being part of something larger and older than herself. She spent the day working in the garden with new energy, planning what she would plant in the fall, thinking about next spring. She would expand the vegetable garden, she decided, would learn more about fruit trees and perhaps plant a few more, would maybe get some goats. She'd always wanted goats, and there was plenty of space for them. The neighbors seemed pleased when she mentioned she was staying. "It's good to have someone in the old place again," Mrs. Anderson said when Sarah walked over to discuss the farming arrangements. "Your grandmother would be happy." Sarah thought that was probably true. She could feel her grandmother's presence here sometimes, not in any supernatural way, but in the sense that the place held the pattern of her life, her care, her choices. The garden laid out according to her design, the fruit trees she had planted, the flowers she had loved. Sarah was simply continuing what her grandmother had begun, adding her own chapter to the story of this place. As July turned toward August, the rhythm of work intensified. There were vegetables to harvest daily now, preserving to be done, the orchard to be prepared for harvest. But it didn't feel like too much. It felt like the natural work of the season, and she met it with steady energy, taking breaks when she needed them, asking for help when tasks were too big to manage alone. The Morrisons' children started coming by in the evening sometimes, drawn by marmalade and the chickens, and Sarah found herself telling them about the garden, teaching them the names of plants, letting them help with the easier tasks. They reminded her of herself at that age, and she understood now why her grandmother had always welcomed her visits, why she had been patient with endless questions and clumsy help. It wasn't just about the work getting done. It was about passing on knowledge, about helping the next generation learn how to tend and care for growing things. One afternoon, she and the children picked blackberries along the fence line, getting scratched by thorns and stained by juice, laughing at each other's purple fingers. That evening, she made a pie with the berries, using her grandmother's recipe, and brought half of it to the Morrison house. The children's faces when they saw it were so full of delight that Sarah felt something warm and full bloom in her own chest. This was what had been missing in the city, she realized. Not just the quiet and the nature and the slower pace, but this sense of connection, of being woven into a community where people looked out for each other, where children knew their neighbors, where the work of living was shared rather than isolating. She had been lonely in the city, she understood now, even when she was surrounded by millions of people. Here, with just a handful of neighbors within walking distance, she felt less alone than she had in years. The evenings remained her favorite time. After the work of the day was done, after dinner was cooked and eaten and cleaned up, she would sit on the porch and watch the light fade from the sky. Sometimes neighbors would stop by, and they would talk quietly, sharing the day's small events. Sometimes she was alone, except for marmalade. Either way was fine. She had learned to be comfortable with silence, with solitude, with her own company. But she had also learned the pleasure of companionship without demand, of being with others in a way that was easy and unforced. The balance between them felt natural here, the way it never had in the city. At night, lying in bed with the windows open, she would listen to the sounds of the farm at rest. The occasional rustle from the chicken coop, the wind in the trees, the distant song of crickets, the sounds of home. And she would fall asleep easily, peacefully, her body tired in a good way, her mind quiet, her heart full. By late August, there were signs everywhere that summer was beginning its slow turn toward fall. The quality of the light changed, becoming more golden, more slanted. The evenings grew cooler, requiring a cardigan or light jacket for porch sitting. The garden, while still producing, had a more tired look, the leaves of the tomato plants yellowing, the bean vines looking ragged. But it was in the orchard that the change was most evident. The apples were ripening, their colors deepening from green to red and gold. The peaches had already been harvested. Sarah had spent a glorious week picking and processing them, her kitchen filled with their fragrant sweetness, the counters covered with jars of jam and canned peach halves. Now it was time for the apples. She had been monitoring them daily, checking their color and firmness, waiting for that perfect moment when they were ready to pick. And that moment had arrived. She recruited help for the harvest, the Morrison children, eager and enthusiastic, and some teenagers from down the road who were happy to earn some money. Together, they worked through the rows of trees, filling basket after basket with apples, the air filled with their laughter and the sweet scent of fruit. It was hard work, but satisfying in a way that Sarah had never experienced in her office job. At the end of each day, you could see what you had accomplished. Baskets of apples lined up, waiting to be sorted and stored. Your muscles ached, but it was a clean ache, the kind that comes from using your body the way it was meant to be used. In the evenings, she processed the apples, making applesauce, apple butter, apple pie filling. The kitchen became a production line, and neighbors dropped by to help, everyone working together while they talked and laughed. Mrs. Chen taught her the proper way to make apple butter, stirring it for hours until it was thick and dark and perfect. Mrs. Anderson showed her how to make apple cider vinegar, setting up the jars that would ferment slowly over the coming months. The abundance was almost overwhelming, but in the best way. The pantry shelves were full now, lined with jars in every shade of red and gold and green. The root cellar, which Sarah had cleaned out and prepared, was stocked with apples and potatoes and squash. There would be food through the winter, plenty of it, and that knowledge brought a sense of security that was deeper than anything money in a bank account had ever provided. As September arrived, Sarah began preparing the garden for its rest. She pulled out the spent plants, adding them to the compost pile. She planted cover crops in some of the beds, following advice from a farming book she'd borrowed from Mrs. Anderson. She harvested the last of the tomatoes, pulling them green before the first frost could get them, wrapping them in newspaper to ripen slowly in the basement. The work was different now, less about growth and abundance, more about completion and preparation. There was a satisfaction in putting the garden to bed properly, in ensuring that the soil would be rich and ready for next spring. Everything was a cycle, she was learning. Nothing truly ended. It just transformed and waited for its next beginning. The mornings were crisp now, requiring a jacket for her porch-sitting ritual. The coffee tasted especially good in the cool air, and she found herself lingering longer, watching the mist rise from the fields as the sun climbed higher. Marmalade had grown a thicker coat and pressed closer against her legs, seeking warmth. The trees were beginning to turn, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. The cottonwoods went yellow, their leaves shimmering gold in the breeze. The wild sumac along the fence line turned brilliant red. The fields, where the corn had been harvested, showed in neat rows of stubble, waiting for the next season's planting. Sarah walked more in the cooler weather, exploring farther from the house, discovering paths and places she hadn't noticed in the heat of summer. She found an old cemetery on a hill about a mile away, the stones weathered and leaning, and spent an afternoon reading the names and dates, imagining the lives of the people buried there. Many of them had lived their entire lives right here, born and died within a few miles of this spot. There was something beautiful in that, she thought, a rootedness that modern life rarely allowed. She had stopped checking her phone obsessively. Social media, which had once felt so important, now seemed distant and irrelevant. What did it matter what people were posting about their lives when she had this life, this real, tactile, present life? She kept in touch with a few close friends, but found she had less and less to say to them about her days. How could she explain the satisfaction of a full pantry, the pleasure of watching chickens scratch in the yard, the peace of an evening with nothing to do but watch the sunset? Some of them worried about her, she knew, thought she was hiding, running away, wasting her education and potential. But she didn't feel like she was wasting anything. She felt like she was finally living in a way that made sense, that was aligned with something true and deep in herself. October brought the first frost, and with it, the final harvests. Sarah dug up the last of the potatoes, marveling at how many had grown from the few seed potatoes she'd planted. She cut back the perennials in the flower beds, divided the ones that needed it, prepared everything for winter. The work was tinged with melancholy. The end of the growing season always was, but also with anticipation for the rest that winter would bring. The trees were at their peak now, the whole landscape a riot of color, gold and orange and red and rust. She spent hours just looking at it, trying to memorize the exact shades, the way the light fell through the colored leaves. Beauty like this couldn't last, which somehow made it more precious. The geese flew over in their perfect V formations, heading south, their calls carrying on the wind. She watched them from the porch, Marmalade beside her, both of them tracking the bird's passage across the sky. There was something stirring about those migrations, those ancient journeys. The birds had been making them for thousands of years, long before humans came to this land, and would continue long after. There was comfort in that continuity. As the month wore on, the trees began to drop their leaves, carpeting the ground in layers of gold and brown. Sarah raked them into piles, but left some for the children to jump in when they came by. Their shrieks of laughter as they leapt into the leaves made all the neighbors smile. It was a sound that had probably echoed around this farm for generations, children playing in autumn leaves, and would hopefully echo for generations more. She had begun planning for next year, what she would plant, what she might add. She had decided on goats, definitely goats, and was researching what she would need to prepare for them. She sketched out an expanded garden, talked to the Andersons about possibly taking on more of the farming herself, rather than leasing the fields. She was thinking long-term now, in years and seasons, rather than months and weeks. Halloween came, and she carved pumpkins from the garden with the Morrison children, roasting the seeds with salt and cinnamon. She handed out candy to the few trick-or-treaters who made it out this far, delighted by their costumes, by their excitement. After they left, she sat on the porch with the carved pumpkins glowing around her, feeling more at home than she had ever felt anywhere. November arrived with shorter days and longer nights. The clocks changed, and suddenly it was dark by 5 o'clock. Sarah adjusted her schedule accordingly, doing her outdoor work earlier, spending the long evenings reading by the fire she'd learned to build in the living room fireplace. The crackle and warmth of a wood fire was another pleasure she'd forgotten existed. The first snow came in mid-November, just a dusting that melted by noon, but it was a harbinger of what was coming. Sarah felt ready for winter in a way she'd never felt ready for anything in the city. The pantry was stocked, the firewood was cut and stacked, the house was tight against the cold. She had warm clothes, good boots, plenty of books. She even had Christmas presents already thought out and mostly made. She'd taken up knitting in the evenings and had scarves and mittens in progress for all her neighbors. The farm in winter would be different, she knew. Quieter, more still. The work would be less, but no less important. Tending the chickens, keeping paths clear, maintaining the house. It would be a time for rest and reflection, for planning and dreaming. And she was ready for it. She realized, as she sat by the fire one evening with Marmalade purring in her lap, that she had stopped thinking about her old life entirely. It wasn't that she regretted it or was running from it. It was simply that this life had filled up all the space inside her that the old life used to occupy. She was complete in a way she hadn't been before. The exhaustion and burnout that had driven her here were gone, healed by months of good work and good rest and good food. But more than that, the restlessness that had always hummed beneath the surface of her city life was gone too. She wasn't waiting for something to happen, wasn't striving for some future version of success. She was simply here, now, living this moment and the next and the next. And it was enough. The first real snow arrived in early December, falling quietly through the night, so that Sarah woke to a transformed world. Everything was white and still. The farm muffled under a blanket of snow that smoothed all the rough edges and made everything look clean and new. She dressed warmly and went out to tend the chickens, her boots crunching in the fresh snow, her breath making clouds in the cold air. The hens were disgruntled about the snow, clucking their disapproval, and she laughed at their indignation. She scattered extra feed for them and made sure their water wasn't frozen, then stood for a moment in the white stillness, just listening. Snow changed the sounds of the farm. It dampened everything, making the world feel smaller, more intimate. She could hear the creek running under its border of ice, the distant caw of a crow, the whisper of snow sliding from a pine branch. But mostly there was silence, vast and peaceful. She walked through the orchard, the trees bare now, their dark branches stark against the white ground and gray sky. They looked different without their leaves, more sculptural, and she could see the structure of them clearly, the main trunk, the way the branches divided and subdivided, the overall shape each tree had grown into. In spring and summer, you saw the abundance. In winter, you saw the bones, the foundation that made the abundance possible. Back at the house, she built up the fire and made herself hot chocolate, the real kind, with milk and cocoa and sugar stirred together on the stove. She had time for such things now, time to do things the slow way, the good way. She sat by the fire with her mug and a book, marmalade curled beside her, and felt utterly content. The days fell into a new rhythm, the winter rhythm. Morning chores, breakfast, some indoor project. She had taken up bread baking and was working her way through her grandmother's recipe box, trying different kinds. The house would fill with the smell of baking bread, warm and yeasty, and she would eat it fresh from the oven with butter and jam, feeling like the luckiest person alive. Afternoons were for reading or knitting or writing in her journal, which had grown thick with observations and thoughts and sketches. She was documenting her first year on the farm, she realized, creating a record that might help her in future years, or might simply serve as a reminder of this transformative time. When cabin fever struck, she would bundle up and go for a walk, tramping through the snow to visit neighbors, or simply to move her body and see the winter landscape. The world was beautiful in winter, she discovered. The bare trees, the snow-covered fields, the way the low sun made everything glow gold and pink at sunrise and sunset. The neighbors checked on each other more in winter, she noticed. Mrs. Chen would call to make sure Sarah had everything she needed. The Andersons would plow her driveway after heavy snows. She would bring bread or cookies when she visited, the traditional offerings of neighborliness. They were taking care of each other the way people did before we had services for everything, when community wasn't optional but essential. Christmas approached, and Sarah found herself excited about it in a way she hadn't been in years. She decorated the house with evergreen branches cut from the property, with pine cones painted white, with strings of cranberries and popcorn she made with the Morrison children one afternoon. The decorations were simple, handmade, and more beautiful than anything she could have bought. On Christmas Eve, she went to the community church, a small white building she passed on her walks, for the candlelight service. She hadn't been to church in years, had forgotten the comfort of it, the sense of being part of something larger. The church was full of her neighbors, everyone dressed up, children squirming in the pews, babies being shushed. They sang the old carols, their voices filling the small space, and when they lit candles at the end and sang Silent Night in the darkness, Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. After the service, there was hot cider and cookies in the church basement, everyone talking and laughing, children running around in their good clothes, now rumpled. Sarah talked with people she'd come to know over the months, accepted invitations to Christmas dinner, felt the warmth of being included, of belonging. She spent Christmas Day with the Andersons, a house full of extended family, 3 generations gathered around a table loaded with food. They welcomed her in like she was family, made space for her at the table, included her in the gift exchange. She was touched to receive hand-knitted socks from Mrs. Anderson, a jar of honey from their own hives, a wooden spoon carved by Mr. Anderson during the long winter evenings. She gave her own gifts, scarves she'd knitted, jars of her apple butter, a photo album she'd made of the farm through the seasons for the children who pored over it with delight. The gifts were simple, but they were given with thought and care, and that made them precious. Walking home that evening, full of good food and good company, she looked up at the stars, so bright in the cold, clear air, and felt grateful beyond words. Grateful for this place, these people, this life. Grateful for the exhaustion that had driven her here, because without it, she might never have found this. Grateful for her grandmother, who had loved this farm and kept it going, so that it could be here when Sarah needed it. The days between Christmas and New Year were quiet, contemplative. Sarah spent them mostly alone, tending the fire, reading, knitting, thinking about the year that was ending and the one that was beginning. She thought about who she had been 12 months ago, exhausted, burned out, disconnected from herself and everything that mattered, and who she was now. She was stronger physically and mentally. She was calmer, more patient, more present. She knew how to do things she'd never imagined doing, canning and preserving, caring for chickens, growing a garden, reading the weather, building a fire. She knew her neighbors' names and their children's names. She knew the sound of her particular rooster, could identify birds by their calls, could tell you which apple tree produced the best fruit. But more than skills and knowledge, she had found something she'd been missing without knowing it was missing. Peace, purpose, place, the sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. On New Year's Eve, she stayed up until midnight, sitting by the fire with a glass of wine, watching the old year turn into the new. At midnight, she raised her glass to the empty room, to Marmalade sleeping in his chair, to the farm, silent under its blanket of snow. To home, she said softly, to being home. And then she went to bed, climbing the familiar stairs in the familiar house, slipping between the familiar sheets and falling asleep to the familiar sounds of the farm at rest. Tomorrow would bring another year, another cycle of seasons, another round of planting and tending and harvesting. And she would be here for all of it, living her life in rhythm with the land, part of the eternal dance of growth and rest, abundance and simplicity, work and peace. This was her life now, and she wouldn't trade it for anything. January was the deepest part of winter, when the cold settled in with determination and the snow seemed permanent, the ground frozen solid. But Sarah had learned to love winter by now, to appreciate its gifts, the forced rest, the clarity of the bare landscape, the way the cold made indoor warmth all the more precious. She spent her mornings tending the chickens, who had mostly stopped laying, keeping them fed and watered and safe. She spent her days reading seed catalogs that had started arriving in the mail, planning next year's garden with the kind of eager anticipation that only a gardener in winter can understand. She made lists, sketched layouts, ordered seeds for varieties she wanted to try. The evenings were long and dark, but she had come to love them. She would make dinner, soup from vegetables she'd canned, bread she'd baked, maybe a roast chicken, and eat at the kitchen table, looking out at the darkened garden. After dinner, she'd settle by the fire with her knitting or a book, marmalade purring beside her, the wind sometimes howling outside, but unable to disturb the warmth and peace within. She had thought she might be lonely, isolated out here in the winter, but she wasn't. The neighbors still visited, trudging through snow for coffee and conversation. She video called her aunt and a few close friends from her old life, though these conversations increasingly felt like talking across a vast distance, not just of miles, but of understanding. They couldn't quite grasp what her life was like now, and she couldn't quite explain it in a way that made sense. But that was okay. She didn't need everyone to understand. She just needed to live the life that was right for her, and this was it. February brought a subtle shift. The days were getting longer, though it was hard to notice at first. But Sarah, attuned now to the cycles of light and dark, could feel it. The sun rose a little earlier each morning, set a little later each evening. It was still winter, would be winter for weeks yet, but the earth was beginning to remember spring. She started some seeds indoors, setting up trays in the sunniest window, checking them anxiously each day for the first signs of germination. When the tiny green shoots finally appeared, pushing up through the soil, she felt a surge of pure joy, life returning, the cycle beginning again. The chickens seemed to sense the changing season too. They became more active, spent more time out in their run, even when there was snow on the ground. And one morning in late February, Sarah found an egg in the nest box. Just one. But it was a promise. The hens were waking up, remembering their purpose, preparing for the abundance to come. She held the egg carefully, this perfect oval of potential, and felt tears sting her eyes. It was just an egg, but it was also everything, proof that life persists, that darkness always gives way to light, that patience and care are always rewarded. March came in like a lion, as it always does, bringing storms that plastered wet snow against the windows and made Sarah glad for the warm house and full pantry. But between the storms were days of increasing warmth, when the snow began to melt in earnest revealing the brown earth beneath. The creek, which had been a quiet trickle under ice all winter, began to run freely, swollen with snowmelt, making a constant rushing sound that she could hear from the house. The birds came back, first the robins, hopping across the muddy lawn, then the red-winged blackbirds, trilling from the cattails by the creek. Each arrival was an event, a celebration, a reminder that the world was turning back toward life. Sarah spent these early spring days working outside whenever the weather allowed, cleaning up the garden beds, spreading compost, preparing for planting. The work felt good after the long winter, her muscles remembering their strength, her body grateful for the movement and the fresh air. She planted peas and spinach in late March, hardy crops that could tolerate the cold. She stood over the freshly planted beds, looking down at the dark soil that showed no sign yet of what lay beneath, and felt the same wonder she'd felt with that first egg. Life waiting to happen, potential gathering its energy, the cycle beginning again. April brought real warmth at last, and with it, an explosion of growth. The grass turned green seemingly overnight. The trees began to leaf out, that brilliant, tender green of new leaves that lasts only a few weeks before deepening into summer's darker shade. The spring bulbs her grandmother had planted years ago pushed up through the soil and bloomed, daffodils and tulips and hyacinth, filling the air with their perfume. The garden seedlings she'd started inside were ready to be hardened off and transplanted. She carried them out each day, setting them in a sheltered spot, letting them adjust to the outdoor conditions gradually. They looked so small and fragile, but she knew they had strength in them, would grow into strong plants that would feed her through the summer and fall. The orchard bloomed just as it had when she first arrived a year ago, and seeing it again brought the year full circle. She had been here through a complete cycle now, spring to summer, to fall to winter, and back to spring again. She had learned the rhythms, had become part of them, and now she was beginning again, but with all the knowledge and experience of the year behind her. She planted the garden in earnest now, working steadily through the days, getting everything in the ground at the right time. Tomatoes after the last frost, squash and cucumbers in the warm soil, beans and more beans, corn in neat rows, herbs in their dedicated bed. She expanded the garden, adding new beds, trying new varieties, building on what had worked and adjusting what hadn't. The work was hard, but satisfying, and at the end of each day, she could see the progress, more beds planted, more of the garden taking shape. She was building something here, she realized. Not just a garden, but a life, a home, a future. Each seed planted was an act of faith, a commitment to being here when they came to harvest. The chickens were laying in earnest now, and she had more eggs than she could use. She sold them to neighbors, gave them away, used them in the baking she did, to give away or sell at the small farm stand she'd set up at the end of the driveway. People stopped by for eggs and vegetables and bread, and often stayed to talk, these exchanges becoming the texture of her social life. She had made a place for herself here, she realized. Not just a physical place, though there was that. Her garden, her chickens, her house with its full pantry and comfortable rooms. But a place in the community, a role, a purpose. People knew her now, relied on her for eggs and produce and good conversation. She was part of the web of relationships that made this small community work. May brought the goats she'd been planning for, 2 sweet young does, sisters, who settled into the pen she'd built for them with cheerful contentment. She named them Clover and Daisy, and they quickly became her constant companions, following her around the yard when she let them out, their funny little voices calling for attention and treats. She loved them instantly and completely, loved their personalities and their curiosity, and the way they seemed to find joy in everything. She loved the work of caring for them, feeding them, cleaning their pen, training them to lead on a halter. They were more work than the chickens, but the reward was greater too, their affection, their entertainment, and eventually, she hoped, milk and maybe kids. The farm was complete now in a way it hadn't been before. House and garden and orchard and chickens and goats. Everything connected, everything serving a purpose, everything contributing to the whole. It was, she realized with a start, exactly what she'd been looking for in the city without knowing it. Not a career or a relationship or any external measure of success. Just this, a life that made sense, where the work mattered and the days had purpose, and she felt at home in her own skin. By the time June arrived, bringing with it the lush abundance of early summer, Sarah could hardly remember the exhausted, burned-out person she'd been a year ago. That felt like a different life, a different person. She had been transformed by this place, by the work and the seasons and the simple act of paying attention. She woke early, as always, but now the rooster's crow felt like a friend's greeting rather than an alarm. She made her coffee and took it to the porch, marmalade winding around her ankles, the goats calling softly from their pen. The sun was already up, the day warm and promising, the garden green and growing. She sat and looked out at the farm she'd tended for a year, seeing not just what was there, but what it represented. Each plant in the garden was a choice she'd made, a seed she'd selected and planted and nurtured. Each animal was a creature she'd chosen to care for, a commitment she'd made. The orchard trees were laden with growing fruit, her harvest to gather when the time came. This was her creation, in partnership with the land and the seasons and the plants and animals. It wasn't about control or domination, but about cooperation, about learning to work with natural rhythms rather than against them. And in learning to do that, she'd found a peace she hadn't known was possible. The garden was producing abundantly now, and she spent her mornings harvesting lettuce and spinach and the first peas, already planning what she would plant in their place when they were finished. The succession planting she'd learned about, the way you could keep the garden producing from early spring to late fall if you timed things right. She had become a competent gardener, she realized with some pride. Not an expert, there was always more to learn, but someone who understood the basics, who could troubleshoot problems, who had developed the instincts that come from paying attention season after season. She knew when plants needed water, could identify common pests, understood about crop rotation and companion planting. And it wasn't just gardening. She'd become competent at so many things she'd never imagined doing. She could fix a fence, repair a chicken coop, trim a goat's hooves, can vegetables, bake bread, split wood, read the weather, identify dozens of birds by sight and sound. She'd become capable in ways that had nothing to do with her education or her former career, but everything to do with living a life close to the land. On her 1-year anniversary, the day she'd first arrived at the farm, she walked the property slowly, deliberately, taking in everything with fresh eyes. The house, which she'd cleaned and painted and made her own. The garden, so much larger now than it had been, producing abundantly. The orchard, where fruit swelled on the branches. The chicken coop with its happy, healthy flock. The goat pen where Clover and Daisy dozed in the afternoon shade. She had done this, with help from neighbors and advice from those who knew more than she did. Yes, but fundamentally, this was her work, her creation, her life. And it was good, better than good. It was exactly right. That evening, she invited her neighbors over for a simple meal. Grilled chicken, vegetables from the garden, bread she'd baked that morning. They sat around the table in the kitchen, the windows open to the June evening, and talked and laughed and shared the food she'd grown and prepared. Looking around at these people who had welcomed her, taught her, become her friends, Sarah felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost took her breath away. A year ago, she hadn't known any of them. Now, they were her community, her support, her people. They had helped her build this life, had shown her the ropes, had been patient with her mistakes, and generous with their knowledge. "Thank you," she said suddenly, interrupting the conversation. "All of you, for everything, for welcoming me, for helping me, for being such good neighbors. I couldn't have done any of this without you." There was a moment of surprised silence, and then Mrs. Chen reached over and patted her hand. "Oh, honey, you gave us a gift too. Seeing this place come alive again, seeing you bloom here, it's been a joy to watch." The others murmured agreement, and Sarah had to blink back tears. She had thought she was the one receiving gifts, the knowledge they shared, the help they offered. But maybe it was mutual. Maybe community worked that way, everyone giving and receiving, the exchange so natural you couldn't always tell which was which. After everyone had gone home and the dishes were washed and put away, Sarah went out to the porch one more time. The stars were brilliant overhead, the Milky Way a river of light across the darkness. The goats were quiet in their pen, the chickens settled for the night. Marmalade curled up in his favorite spot on the porch swing. She sat down beside him, stroking his warm fur, listening to his purr, and thought about the journey that had brought her here, the exhaustion and stress that had driven her from the city, the tentative arrival, not sure if this was running away or running toward something, the slow healing through the seasons, the discovery that a simple life could be rich beyond measure. She hadn't known a year ago that she was capable of this life, hadn't known that she could find such deep satisfaction in growing food, tending animals, being part of a community, hadn't known that the things that made life meaningful weren't the things she'd been chasing in the city, success, achievement, recognition, but these quieter things, honest work, good neighbors, fresh food, clear air, and the steady turning of the seasons. She had changed, fundamentally and permanently. The city life she'd left behind now seemed like something from another lifetime, something that had happened to someone else. She couldn't imagine going back, couldn't imagine giving up these quiet mornings and peaceful evenings, this work that made sense, this life that felt true. The farm had healed her, yes, but more than that, it had shown her who she really was beneath all the conditioning and expectations. She wasn't made for the speed and noise and constant stimulation of modern life. She was made for this, for the slow rhythm of the seasons, for the honest work of growing food, for the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent. And knowing that, finally knowing herself in this deep way, was worth everything she'd given up to get here. She sat on the porch until the moon rose, huge and golden above the eastern horizon, casting everything in silver light. The fields, the orchard, the garden, all transformed by moonlight into something magical, mysterious, more beautiful than any painting. Tomorrow would bring another day of work and rest and simple pleasures. The garden would need tending, the animals would need feeding, life would continue in its reliable rhythms. And she would be here for all of it, living each moment fully, grateful for this place and this life and this second chance to get it right. Sarah smiled and stretched, feeling her body tired in that good way that comes from a day of honest work. She called softly to Marmalade, who opened one eye to regard her, then rose and followed her inside. She locked the door, checked that the fire was banked, and climbed the stairs to bed. In the darkness of her room, she could hear the familiar sounds, the house settling, the wind in the cottonwoods, an owl calling from the orchard. These were the sounds of home, and they lulled her quickly toward sleep. Her last thought before drifting off was simple and profound. She was exactly where she belonged, living exactly the life she was meant to live. And in the morning, she would wake and do it all over again, each day a gift, each season a blessing, each moment an opportunity to be present and grateful and alive. The farm would be here, steady and patient, offering its gifts of purpose and peace and belonging. And she would be here too, tending and caring and growing, not just the garden and animals, but herself, becoming more fully herself with each passing season. This was her life now. This was home. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.